Hi, I'm Greg Johnson from the Small House Society, and the following slideshow is a presentation that I gave at Luther College for the Big Tiny House event on the 25th of April, 2015. There were quite a few people who had expressed an interest in going to the event and weren't able to, so I thought I would just kind of walk through my presentation at least and touch briefly on some of the points for those of you who wanted to get a taste of what I presented. So here on the second slide, the first slide you saw, I was just standing in the entryway to my tiny house that I lived in from 2003 to 2009. And once I got married, I moved into about 360 square feet, not much bigger, which was actually an efficiency apartment. And in the second slide, I'm standing in the entryway to the tiny house with my wife, Mucker, and in the back you can see flag, which is the Earth flag. I had that flying, I think, pretty much for the entire time that I lived in the tiny home. So the slideshow basically covers just about 5 points, roughly. There's the background and context of how I got involved with the small house movement, and then a little bit about my small house story, how I moved into a tiny home and how that worked out, what some of the challenges were, some of the benefits, and then what I see to be the future of the small house movement and how I would want to be involved. So talking a little bit about the context, when I got started in the small house movement, there really wasn't a small house movement. There was Jay Schaefer living in his tiny house, and that was back in the year 2000. So this was before people really started doing this. So I didn't have that context, that we have today to frame this. I, growing up just like all of us, was exposed to these, illustrated children's books that kind of have a romanticized presentation of tiny habitations, right? Winnie the Pooh, Three Little Pigs, The Three Bears, etc. We have kind of repeated images in our mind of little cabins and cottages, and Rabbit had a hole in the ground, but all these places were very cozy places. And then growing up, you play in forts and playhouses and clubhouses and tree houses, and these kind of like recreations in the physical world of what you were reading about maybe when you were younger in these children's books. And then getting a little bit older yet, for myself at least, going on vacation, some of my favorite memories, best memories, were of vacations when we would go and stay in cabins and cottages. In particular, there was an off-the-grid cabin in the mountains of West Virginia that was just a great experience for me. I would go with my dad and my brother, and there are a few memories I have from that, but one in particular that stands out is every day or every few days, I guess it was, we'd go down to the spring with a bucket and get the water for the house, and that water would be poured into a holding tank above the kitchen sink, and that was the sink in the cabin. So you would wash the dishes or wash your hands or maybe brush your teeth in there. Those were kind of the experiences I had growing up that influenced how I viewed tiny houses. When I saw Jay Schaefer, my recollection is it was a cover story in the Des Moines Register where he was featured in his tiny house, and I looked at that and I thought, well, wow, I didn't even think a person could do that, but that just looks really cool. So eventually I got in touch with Jay, and by the year 2002, in working with Jay and some other folks, we started the Small House Society. And so that kind of was the start of my tiny house story, in talking to Jay and others, learning about smaller living. I found out more about that, and the launch of the Small House Society then was initially just establishing some web pages on resourcesforlife.com, which is a website I already had set up, and expanding on that, and then later, as it grew, creating a dedicated website, smallhousesociety.net, which is also, you can go to the .com and the .org for that. But being given this honorary position of president of the Small House Society. Jay and Shea Solomon and Nigel Valdez also were involved in the launch of this. They were saying, well, why don't you be the president? And initially, I guess there was, to some extent, I would say, some absurdity to the idea that there would be a small house society, this society of people living in tiny houses, because there was no such thing, really, other than Jay and maybe some other small examples. It was not something we imagined would be requiring a president in a large organization. But anyway, so we did that. And then by the spring of 2003, I thought, well, if I'm going to be heading up this organization about tiny houses, I should be living in one. So I talked to Jay Schaefer about building a tiny house. And when we explored the design of the house, knowing that Jay had a background as an art professor, I thought, artists have this amazing way of just creating from their imagination. And I wanted to see what he would make. So I said, just build a house however you think you would want to design it, and I'm sure it'll be fine. So that actually, I guess, saves some time, because normally there is that kind of long process of looking at different house plans and, talking about the home design, and you always get the future owner of the home telling the architect or designer or builder what to do. And so we skipped past all that, and I just, I trusted Jay's judgment, and was glad that I did, because I think, sometimes we tend to, even though we have less experience than somebody, whether they're, working on our car or doing whatever, we tend to interject our own ideas, and that can derail things. So yeah, he designed it, and I was able that summer of 2003 then to work with him over a period of a couple of months building the house, and it was done by August of 2003. But and I wrote a book then about the experience of living in that house for 6 years, and the title and the cover is here: "Put Your Life on a Diet: Lessons Learned from Living in 140 Square Feet." And so you can explore that more through the book, or even just through the website, which is putyourlifeonadiet.com. Will take you to further reading and presentations about that. But basically, it was a great experience, and I had actually not planned on there being much attention at all to somebody living in a house the size of a garden shed. I just thought it would be kind of a fun way to, sort of like camping, since the home was off the grid. But yeah, it turned out there was a lot of media coverage, which was kind of interesting, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then over the last since really 2002, so over the last 12 years, 13 years, I've been the facilitator and overseeing the Small House Society, which has grown quite a bit. We have almost 20,000 people connected to the organization in one form or another. This is a photo on slide 6 of me with a little cook stove inside the house. And one point that this raises in this photo, you can see possibly on my left or on the right side of the picture, is the sink area. And then on the other side, on the left side of the picture, is the office. And then in the middle is this dining table that pulls out from storage. So in tiny spaces, you want to have multiple uses for the same space, right? So instead of having a separate dining room, kitchen, study, etc., it's all in one room, because you're not going to be, eating and doing the dishes and working on your laptop computer at the same time. You do one task at a time. So there's really no need to have repetition of rooms, right? And that's partly how the space-saving aspects of small house living work out. And that was something that originally I'd been inspired by going to Tama, Iowa, where I saw these what are called longhouses. And in the longhouse, Tama, Iowa, I should explain, is a reservation for the Meskwaki Indian tribe. And my dad had an Indian teacher there, a sort of spiritual guide leader, who we would go visit from time to time. And And so in visiting him, I'd seen this longhouse where he and his family lived. And what was interesting about that was it's this one long open house, and you go in there, and then whatever's happening is what the house is dedicated to. So if you're like cooking a meal, then all the surfaces around are part of that cooking the meal process. And then if you're eating a meal, then the whole house becomes like one big dining room, you know. And if it's time to go to sleep, well, then you move things around and suddenly it's one huge bedroom. So it's like this one big house that morphs into whatever you want it to be. And when I'd seen that back in like the 1970s, I just, it stuck in my mind as kind of a cool approach to living, you know, like just having everything in the same room. And I'd mentioned, you know, some of the media attention that came to the tiny house movement, which I guess in a way, as far as houses on wheels, all I knew of at the time was just myself and Jay. I began getting, you know, calls from, first it was actually public radio out of Chicago was like the big, first big media coverage that I recall. And that was not long before, or not long after moving into my tiny house. And then that sort of started the snowball effect where other media outlets heard about it. And, you know, one thing I like to point out is that from the standpoint of wanting to promote tiny living, it was such an amazing experience because if a person wanted to promote smaller, simpler, minimalistic living, and if you wanted to pay for advertising to do that in all these major media outlets, right, it would cost millions of dollars, you know. So the fact that all these folks came forward and said, hey, we want to write about this phenomenon, it was great. And it really helped bring things into the mainstream. So that was something kind of amazing and something to be appreciative of. People often ask, what are some of the challenges with living in a tiny house? And certainly the first challenge, which doesn't really have anything to do with building a house or designing a house or anything, is more just internal, is like deciding what's important to you and deciding what are your priorities. So stuff generally has its connection with some activity we engage in, right? Books or music or collecting things or whatever. So by living in a smaller space, we're sort of, forced to make those decisions about what's important in life. And it's a really helpful process to go through because, you know, we should do that anyway, probably. We should take a moment to say, hey, what's really important? And then remove all the clutter because the clutter just gets in the way of what's important. Okay, so that's one challenge I think that people have to go through is that process. And then certainly guests, you know, you're not going to have a dozen people over to spend the night or to have Thanksgiving dinner or something in a 10-by-7 house. So that can be a challenge, but it's also an opportunity to, you know, share community spaces like meeting with friends and family for whatever events in public spaces rather than your home being that space. And then food for me, I was probably living a little more austere life than most people would need to at all, really. I chose not to have electricity, no running water, no bathroom, no shower, no refrigerator. You know, it was basically just a cabin totally off the grid. And so with food, I decided to live a vegan lifestyle. At home, I just kept, you know, nuts and grains and fruits and vegetables that would keep for several days without refrigeration. And I didn't need then the refrigerator for milk or meat or whatever, because I just felt like the refrigerator was something I couldn't really create power for from like a solar panel. You know, they really do take a lot of electricity and they need it all the time. Little lights I could probably get by with an LED light and some rechargeable batteries or something, but refrigerator, you're not going to use like AA batteries to run that thing. And I just wanted to kind of reduce my footprint. So that's what I did, but it's certainly not necessary. Even so, you know, you're not going to have a huge pantry. You're not going to have an oversized refrigerator and a deep freeze and all that people often will have. You won't have that probably in a tiny, tiny house. So unless there's like a central community kitchen and food area where you have those kinds of amenities, that's something to be mindful of, is where are you going to store your food and how are you going to prepare it. And food preparation also takes some energy and takes some time. So to the extent that you can simplify that, that's a good thing. And wardrobe, there again, when you're living in a house that's about the size of some people's walk-in closets, you're going to have to downsize your wardrobe and simplify your clothing choices. So, and again, just deciding what's important. What kind of clothing do you like? What do you want? And finally, just the whole category of amenities, electricity, fresh water, wastewater cooling, these issues. Because of the small house zoning laws, you're actually able to have, for up to 30 days, you're able to live in an RV or a camper. Like if you had a home and some friends were visiting and they had a camper, they could stay there for 30 days and they could hook up to the electricity. But if somebody stays hooked up to electricity for more than 30 days, then the city zoning laws in most municipalities would consider that to be something that's becoming permanent. So, they don't want you to do that. So for me, that was why I thought, I don't want to be dealing with violating some laws. I'm just going to not hook up to those things. And that's why I did that. But those were the major challenges I saw, and they weren't insurmountable. And certainly there are things that people have done to get around those. So here's a picture of the kitchen area, which you can see is smaller than the average kitchen. It's just kind of a small sink that you might have in a bar, wet bar, and a little bit of room on either side. I have some plants there, and the water jugs were, for me, a way to connect back with what I mentioned earlier, the time when I would go camping with family in the mountains of West Virginia and carry the water back to the house. So I wanted to kind of relive that experience, and that was fun to do by just putting water in these jugs. And it was plenty for washing my hands, brushing my teeth, whatever, cleaning some dishes if needed. And then the drain just went to a water collection, gray water collection, which of course then that was not contaminated at all. It was just water that had been used for washing hands. So that could be disposed of properly. And but again, for depending on the size of the tiny house, the kitchen may be an issue for somebody who wants a larger cooking area. And then something I like to bring up also is the fact that these homes are on wheels, so they are movable, but it's not very easy to move them. And so you either need to own a truck or know somebody who owns a truck. And pictured here is, a pretty hefty diesel truck. I met some people in the Iowa City area that were able to move the house for me during a time when I wanted to have an open house downtown in Iowa City. I put the house on display, which was actually a few slides back there on the slide 3, the overview. That picture was taken in downtown Iowa City at the book signing and reading. And some of the benefits then of living in a tiny house, I would say, are, first of all, for me, it was very quiet. As I said, it was off the grid, so I didn't have the noise of a furnace or household appliances. So for just sleeping or meditating or whatever you want to do that's going to take advantage of that quietness, that was a real advantage. And then also it was just quick and easy to clean. You can see in the picture here the shine on the floor from the heater pictured on the wall. You just sweep it up a little bit and suddenly the dust and the dirt that might be there is just gone. And that was really nice to live in a clean space that's clean all over and didn't have to spend a lot of time keeping it up. Certainly it's inexpensive, to build and to own a tiny house. And on that point, because it was a lot smaller and because I had fewer building materials, I could go with higher quality building materials. So I went with stainless steel surfaces, solid wood everywhere. Solid cedar siding on the outside was very nice to have. It kept the bugs off. Metal roof, so very low maintenance. The windows were very nice, high insulation kind of windows. So that's a nice thing about coming in under budget in terms of the cost of what other homes would cost, but then having really high quality. And then because of the high quality materials that you can put into a tiny house, it'll be efficient. And it'll be efficient in terms of, the space as well. You won't be walking around a huge home to find things or to get your work done. Everything's right at arm's reach. So that's a benefit. And the fact that you've already been through that process of picking out what's important. You're more purposeful and intentional about how you use the space. So it's kind of hard to explain, but once you live through it, you realize that it's kind of neat. So anyway, and then sustainable, lower energy bills. And in a smaller space, solar power and wind power become more viable, right? Because for example, I met with somebody who had built a home and they wanted the entire home to be off the grid, but it was like 2,500 square feet, right? So that home, it cost them $30,000 just for the solar panels, the wind generator, the battery backup, and the whole electrical system to run that was like $30,000. Well, by contrast, the system I put together that gave me some, DC voltage to work with if I needed it was just a couple of boat batteries for like a few $100s. With that and an inverter, I could do just about anything I wanted to, and then occasionally charge it up off the grid or on the grid or however I wanted to charge that up using green energy credits. But the point is that a couple of batteries, that's a much more practical and simple and economical solution than $30,000. And when you're dealing with a smaller space, you need less lighting, you need less everything. And, as a result of being in a small space, I found I was more social, which is a good thing. That's good for your health, and it's just more enriching life to be connecting with people more often. And a point I like to make is that I was not using less space necessarily. I mean, I did have to go through that process of thinking how I wanted to use the smaller space at home, but I continued to go to the gym and go to the laundromat, wash my clothes at the laundry facility, meet friends at a coffee shop. So I was living in larger spaces outside of home, but at least the time I was spending at home was a smaller space. And by outsourcing those things, the cost and the care of those facilities then shifted to someone else. So I'm not sitting at home dusting down my treadmill, and then waiting at home for the repair person to come and fix it because somebody else is taking care of all that, the electricity to run it or whatever. So there's a real advantage there to outsourcing as much as you can, not just the kind of cost of it, but really the care and the space required to maintain it. And something for me that was a benefit was the natural light. In a traditional home, you're going to have rooms that face east or west or south or north or whatever, or inside rooms that don't have any light at all, at least no windows. And so in a tiny house, you would think it would be kind of claustrophobic in there, but actually with windows on the north and south and east and west, you get light coming in 24 hours, well, not 24 hours a day, all day long, say, 8 hours. But you get light coming in from the east, light coming in from the west, throughout the day. So it's a very well-lit space, right? You don't get that in most large homes because there's no one room that has windows on all four walls. So I liked that, and I liked the fact that, looking out of the window, I saw nature, right? So wherever I was looking, there were trees around, and instead of seeing walls, I saw beyond the walls, which gives you kind of an openness. There's a picture here of me sitting at my laptop computer, and that brings up the point, about electricity. Most of us are somewhere during the day, coffee shop or work or whatever. You can charge up your cell phone, you can charge up your laptop computer, and for the few hours at night that you're going to, check some emails, I was able to, most of the time, just rely on that and not really need to use my batteries at home for my electrical equipment. I did use the batteries for some fans, some 12-volt fans, that I got from Radio Shack that were computer fans, and those I put in the window above the heater to vent air out, and it would pull air in from the upstairs, so I would get a really nice wind tunnel effect going in the upstairs. At night particularly, it would keep it very cool in the summertime. You might see above the computer here at the desk, an outlet. So I did have the house wired for AC electrical, and with that inverter that I mentioned, I could deliver AC power to the house from the 12-volt battery boat battery. So that was really cool. I liked being able to do that if needed. Here's a picture on the left. You can see the clothes storage area for shirts and pants, and then on the right is just again a picture of the heater, as you would see coming into the house on the back wall there. To wrap up, I wanted to just talk a little bit about what I envision the future of my involvement with the small house movement, and certainly I think this probably parallels what many people are doing these days. But to kind of summarize it in a few bullet points, what I see are a group of people who are helping to facilitate move things forward, right? So that would be media and journalists, and those folks are really, as I mentioned earlier, helping by providing the equivalent of millions of dollars in donations, essentially, in-kind donations, by writing up these stories and getting the word out to millions of people around the world. So I want to be responsive. When people call from the media, whether it's TV or radio or writing an article, I want to help them meet those deadlines, because often they just have like 1 or 2 days before their story has to be turned in. And so instead of being too busy or too shy, I just help out as much as I can. And then also, in this list of people who are involved would be small house builders, people that are designing and building these homes for others. And certainly small house dwellers, people that are seeking to buy homes or wanting to build on their own or whatever, or currently living in tiny homes. However I can help them, I try to do so through the Small House Society. They're bloggers and website owners that are writing about this phenomenon. They're authors, people writing books. They're architects and developers who have been around for years, who are now starting to serve the small house society, the smaller house movement, and people, living in smaller homes and smaller apartments. And then certainly, public speakers, higher education, local groups, pocket neighborhoods, tiny house communities, and local chapters of the Small House Society. So, briefly, those are the folks that I really try to be serving as best I can. And as an example of a tiny house community would be in Iowa City. Doug Williams, the brother of Dee Williams, has a tiny house you can see pictured here. And I was talking to Doug and asking him if he had a web presence and social media, and he said he didn't. He was interested in it, but just had not had the time or ability to set that up at the time. So I volunteered to set up a website and Facebook page and things for Doug and his group, and it really has grown, and that's been inspiring for me to see that these kinds of groups can pop up and grow just about anywhere. As you can see here, the group has over 470 members on Facebook, so that's pretty good for just a local city small house advocacy group. And then here's the Small House Society website. You can see pictured. That's just smallhousesociety.net. There's a photo here of me and Dee Williams and Jay Schaefer from a trip that Jay and I took down the coast from Canada down to Mexico. And we had stopped to have open houses and meet with people and do some workshops along the way. It was back in 2008, and that was a good time. Met with a lot of people who were just getting involved in the small house movement. And there are a couple of slides here from stops along the way. There's one here with Jay and a group in Los Angeles meeting for one of his tiny house workshops. And that was fascinating to be part of and meet some of the folks that are building. And then here's another picture of some people in a neighborhood that just lined up down the street to see the open house. Lots of people were turning out to see this, and another photo with some bikes and people along the sidewalk. But everywhere we stopped, there were, large groups of people showing up to see the homes. And then here toward the end, you can see a picture of Jay with one of his workshops at his home in California there. and finally a picture outside of Google. So I thought it would be funny if you like Googled small house and then you saw a small house by the Google headquarters, right? So anyway, I hope that this recording has helped get the information out there to people that wanted to see the presentation. And I know there are going to be some other resources online that you can find as well, and I'll try to link to those. So thanks so much for your interest and for watching and listening, and I hope to hear from you soon. Thanks.